A lot of people are a little confused when they hear Jens Stoltenberg and Biden saying, you know, we are boosting troops, we are boosting our armaments on the borders there in Poland. And I think a lot of people will ask, well, why not in Ukraine? That's where the invasion is.
Exactly. And the simple answer is that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. They don't have that obligation, that treaty obligation to do that. And they don't want to do that. And the simple reason they don't want to do that is because they, of course, have intervened in areas of non-NATO areas before.
Iraq, Afghanistan as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Is that Putin has nuclear weapons and he's threatened to use them. He has very recently threatened that if any country or any force opposes him, or they will find they'll experience the full wrath of unimaginable force. And that's only, you know, it's a reference to nuclear weapons. And he's very fond of reminding the world that his is a nuclear-powered company, a nuclear weapon-ready country. And that's what stopped, I think, NATO from actually confronting him in Ukraine. And unfortunately, that means that Ukrainians are absolutely on their own. You're right. All this talk about reinforcing armies in NATO, well, that's fine. That's fine for those countries. It does nothing to secure the peace in Ukraine and does nothing to stop Putin's troops.
And Vladimir Putin knew this beforehand, didn't he? Because as we were speaking to our guest earlier, for Vladimir Putin, politics is a game of dominance.
Absolutely.
So he knew this going in.
And the moment that President Biden said, and that all the European leaders said, we're not going to intervene militarily, that was the green light. He knew then, OK, well, we're going to have to suffer sanctions, but that's not stopped him in the past. He's had sanctions over MH17. He's had sanctions over Crimea before. I was covering the war in Georgia in 2008. That didn't affect him in any sort of substantial way. He's not actually influenced by these fiscal penalties, in a sense. What he is influenced by is the chance of a brute force resistance to whatever he's putting out in the field. And as we see at the moment, there's nothing. I mean, isn't it desperate that the president of Ukraine is calling people in Ukraine to fill bottles with petrol, to make bombs, handing out guns to people that have never fired them before? That is the act of a very desperate man in a very desperate situation. And of course, his personal safety, as he says, is very much under threat, and the safety of his family. And the gun is firmly at his head at the moment, but his nation's head. Putin says, well, we offer you talks in Belarus, peace talks, but first of all, you've got to lay down your arms. In other words, you've got to surrender, unconditionally surrender, and then we'll talk. Well, what civilised nation does that?
And it appears tonight as if Russia is closing in on the capital, Kiev. In the latest development out of there, authorities have told residents of the northwestern Obolon area to stay off the streets, given active hostilities were approaching. Videos are circulating showing armoured vehicles in the area. Overnight, Russia continued bombarding the capital with multiple explosions reported and apartment buildings damaged. And tonight, the Kremlin has announced retaliatory sanctions against the West. A spokesperson says Russia will ensure demilitarization of Ukraine, but has declined to comment on how long the invasion will last. Russian forces have seized the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and Ukraine's nuclear agency reports recording increased radiation levels due to the movement of heavy military equipment in the area, lifting radioactive dust into the air. Well, let's take a look at some video which came in during the last hour. It appears to show armoured vehicles driving through Obolon. That's the area north of Kiev's city centre. Ukraine's defence ministry says Russian forces had infiltrated the residential district. The videos appear to have been taken by locals in their homes. Well, Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins is in Lviv, and she says the Ukrainian capital is at the centre of Russia's invasion.
Well, Yvonne, things are certainly escalating here, and undeniably the capital, Kiev, is now at the centre of the invasion. Throughout the morning here, we've been watching local media reports, and we're hearing from Ukraine's military who say that they are taking every step they can to protect the capital. On local media here, there were reports that they were blowing up bombs to try and stop tanks from accessing that city. We were hearing reports of fierce fighting between Ukrainian and Russian troops over critical infrastructure like airports. And as you say, social media videos are emerging, and it shows things like Russian tanks on the outskirts of the capital in certain areas. There are also reports of gunfire near government buildings. So yes, things are looking incredibly serious in Kiev, and if Russian forces are trying to target government buildings, it sends a very ominous message. Ukraine's president has said that he feels that he is the target of these attacks, that he feels that Russia is trying to destabilise his government, if not to overthrow it. Now, in recent hours, he has made admissions in speeches that he would be happy to discuss neutrality, that Ukraine would be willing to stand down from its ambitions of joining NATO, and that has been a critical flashpoint in this entire issue, between this entire conflict between Russia and Ukraine, was that Ukraine wanted to join NATO. It wanted to join an alliance, a military alliance, very much associated with the West. Russia didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of the West moving into Eastern Europe. So while Ukraine's military is absolutely trying to defend the capital, we are already seeing some concessions here from Ukraine, willing to talk and negotiate with Russia as they call for a ceasefire.
Some really key developments there, Isabella. Tell us what your experience has been like reporting from there. What was it like to be rushed to the bomb shelter? What is the atmosphere like when you talk to people there? Apart from the noise will persist.
Yvonne, it's Yvonne, waking up to air sirens, it was about as loud as that noise pollution, but it's not something that anyone really wants to wake up to. Here in this hotel, staff rushed up, they pulled all of the guests down to the basement, and your nerves are incredibly heightened. You don't know what's going to happen. Thankfully for us, despite the fact that there were the sirens going off, this city was safe and we were fine, we were let out, but officials are urging people here to be on alert, to listen out for those. And other local media reports, they say that shelling is happening all around this country. It's not just in the east, the south or the north or in Kiev, that there are reports around the place. So this situation is escalating, and it gives Ukrainians a sense that perhaps nowhere is truly safe. Many people had migrated to this city because they thought it was a long way away from the military offensive, but it's not looking certain what could happen next. We know that many people are abandoning this country, that they're going to safer ground. They're heading to places like Poland and Romania. We're hearing reports that the line to get into Poland is kilometres and kilometres long, that it is very difficult to get over there, that border guards are absolutely inundated. But remarkably, what Ukraine has done is they have said that no Ukrainian men between the age of 18 and 60 should be allowed to cross, should be allowed to leave, because they want to keep them here, because they need to bolster their military power. And they are calling on all civilians, and they're looking at young men to join the ranks and to help them keep fighting.
And since we spoke to Isabella about an hour ago, another air raid siren has rung out in the location where she was reporting from, the city of Lviv in western Ukraine. If, of course, there are any updates from there, we will bring them to you as soon as we can. Well, the United States has unveiled a tougher package of sanctions aimed at devastating the Russian economy in the wake of the invasion. President Joe Biden has accused Russia of launching a premeditated attack on Ukraine, saying Vladimir Putin will bear the consequences of his decisions. North America correspondent Jade McMillan has more.
US Army helicopters land in Latvia, helping to reinforce Baltic defences as nearby Ukraine comes under attack.
Peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history.
The United States is sending thousands of troops to help bolster NATO's eastern flank should Russian forces descend on their borders.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. without provocation, without justification, without necessity. This is a premeditated attack.
Joe Biden has unveiled a second, more severe set of sanctions targeting large Russian banks and wealthy individuals, as well as blocking access to cutting-edge technologies needed to modernise the Russian military, its space program and economy. The US is still holding out the option of sanctions against Vladimir Putin himself, but insists the package as it stands will have devastating consequences.
This is going to take time. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will.
It's not without cost at home, with the president promising to try to limit the impact on American consumers.
Stand with Ukraine! Stand with Ukraine!
Joe Biden has again vowed that he won't be sending US troops into Ukraine itself. It is not a member of NATO, and there is little appetite here among the American public for heavy involvement in another war. But for the Ukrainians living abroad and watching on, there is a strong belief that Western leaders could still be doing more to punish Russia.
It's heartbreaking. We couldn't sleep. We are on the phone with our families and friends over there. And we just try to do whatever we can from this side. And it's painful.
Some Russians are also horrified at what's unfolding.
I don't think it's possible to change anything until we change the whole regime.
The UN Security Council will vote tomorrow on a draft resolution to condemn the invasion.
I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia.
Russia's veto power means the motion is destined to fail, but at the very least it's hoped it will send a message about how isolated Moscow's become. Jade McMillan, ABC News, Washington.
Reports of increased radiation levels have been made from Chernobyl after Russian forces took over the closed nuclear facility. Sergei Ivanchuk is the owner of a Chernobyl tour company and owns a cottage 5 kilometres from the exclusion zone. He says that the heavy use of the military equipment there has raised radiation levels.
The information I have from my staff that actually live 5 kilometers from the checkpoint to Chernobyl zone is not good. It's already occupied by Russian forces.
Has the site been damaged in any way? What are you hearing?
Well, the Chernobyl exclusion zone has a monitoring system, and it does show a rise of radiation, but more likely it's not because the nuclear waste storage facilities are damaged, but the heavy use of the machine and tanks on the soil. So basically, if they drive not on the road, but on the soil, on the ground near the soil, they can raise a little bit of radioactive dust. So then there is a little bit of rise, not big, rise of radiation in the air right now.
And what are your concerns now that it's under Russian control in terms of safety around the area?
Well, I mean, you can't trust Russians now. I mean, everybody understands that. So I don't know what is in their head. Do they want to destroy those facilities to make more harm? I don't know. They will use it to threaten Ukraine. I have no idea. But it's pretty dangerous situation, just to my mind.
Do you have any further thoughts on why it was targeted by Russia?
Well, it's said like many times, but we all know that there are a few dozens of ex-KGB old, mentally probably not stable people who lives in their own world. So, and that's the main reason.
You've been carrying out tours in the area for many years now. Tell us a bit more about the site and the operations that go on there and how they've been disrupted now that it's been taken over.
So usually there are about 3,000 people at a time at the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Some work at the power plant, some scientists, some monitor the situation with radiation, forestry, etc. So at this point, as far as I know, most of them are evacuated to Kyiv, right before the Russian troops occupied the territory.
And tourists were still visiting Chernobyl about a week ago. Was there any indication that this might happen? Had you been concerned?
Well, we were concerned when they made a bridge, like a military bridge over the Pripyat River last week. So, and yeah, last tour was actually last Saturday with tourists. So, but we, like, frankly, most of us, we were totally unexpected what happened.
Well, Europe is imposing sanctions on Russia designed to cripple its economy and force an end to the military assault. The EU has called the invasion a barbaric threat to the continent's stability, while the UK Prime Minister said President Putin was a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest. International affairs analyst Stan Grant reports.
Dissent in the Russian capital. Muscovites marched outside the city's cultural heart. These are the people publicly defying Putin, risking arrest, and they were pulled off the streets in their hundreds. No to war, they shouted in St. Petersburg as well.
We believe that conflict must be resolved peacefully, without violence from either side.
He must stop. I don't know what we can do, except to say that we disagree.
Across Europe, there were shows of solidarity with Ukraine, from Poland to Hungary and Romania. The drums of war echoed through the night. While their people protested, Europe's leaders huddled in Brussels to concoct a united response.
History has seen before, in World War II, a deluded autocrat creating misery for millions. We're seeing the same thing today.
We don't need sanctions that bark. We need sanctions that bite.
The EU will freeze Russian assets in the bloc, stopping access to European markets, trade, energy and transport.
This package includes financial sanctions that cut Russia's access to the most important capital markets.
Cutting access to the SWIFT global payment system was opposed by Germany, a key Russian trading partner. In a televised address from London, the UK's Prime Minister went further.
Diplomatically, politically, economically and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Boris Johnson said Russian banks won't be able to access sterling. Russian companies will be stopped from borrowing UK money, and oligarchs will have limits on the amount they can deposit.
I can confirm, as I've always said, that nothing is off the table.
Sanctions and sacrifices that will be felt by all sides. Stan Grant, ABC News.
Well, Europe correspondent Steve Kinane joins us now out of London. Now, Steve, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has spoken today. What did he have to say?
Yvonne, he just gave a press conference which included, this is in the last hour, which included questions coming online from foreign journalists. Now, a disclaimer, everything I'm about to tell you, just bear in mind that Sergei Lavrov said last week that Russia had no plans to invade Ukraine. So take whatever you hear from this point onwards with a grain of salt. He repeated the line that Vladimir Putin did not want to occupy Ukraine, but simply demilitarize it. He says Russia wants to free Ukraine from oppression and allow Ukrainians to freely determine their future. He said that Russia does not recognise Ukraine as a democratic country. So those two statements sound like they want Zelensky out. They want regime change. And going back to what we talked about last hour, Yvonne, where the US defence official had made those comments that they believe Russia wants to decapitate the government. This was all adding up, isn't it? You've got the troops and the tanks encircling Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and you hear these kind of comments undermining the credibility of the government, suggesting it's not a proper democratically elected government. Quite ironic when you could consider that over 1,800 people have been arrested for protesting against the war in Russia in the last 24 hours. The Kremlin also made the comments in that, well, via Sergei Lavrov, that they will impose retaliatory sanctions on the West. They wouldn't say how long. There was a lot of questions asked that they wouldn't answer. This is Sergei Lavrov. Wouldn't answer the question on how long military operations would last. Would not answer any questions about how many Ukrainian civilians had been killed either. Now, here's a key point worth mentioning. Apparently, a presidential advisor has told to President Zelensky of Ukraine, has told Reuters that Ukraine is willing to discuss neutral status when it comes to joining or not joining NATO. But Sergei Lavrov said in that press conference that President Zelensky is lying when he says that. So that's a bit of a summary of some of the comments that Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said in the last hour.
And Steve, as we speak, there are real concerns as Russian forces close in on the capital. We've seen armoured vehicles on the streets north of Kiev, and that is amid continued shelling of cities across the country. Things are changing by the hour, as you've said. What's the latest on the ground?
Yeah, we're hearing of heavy shelling in Kharkiv, which is a city of 1.5 million people, directly south of Moscow. It's a border city. It's Ukraine's second largest city. So we're hearing of shelling going on there. And yes, troops and tanks in Kiev, particularly the northern area, we're hearing. There's reports of gun battles going on too in that northern part of the capital. And the Ukrainian ministry has released a public statement via social media to the citizens of Kyiv saying, "We urge citizens to inform us of troop movements, to make Molotov cocktails and to neutralise the enemy." They also have confirmed that in the past 24 hours they've handed out 18,000 assault rifles and ammunition to give to their citizens. So it's not just the Ukrainian military they are relying on to defend their capital. They're relying on the citizens who remain in Kyiv and also that territorial defence force that we talked about earlier, those volunteers who've been training in the last few months on how to protect their city, how to protect their infrastructure, how to protect their nation if there was a Russian invasion.